Well, it's early morning here, but I'm going to see if I can read another chapter in this book, The Persian Pickle Club by Sandra Dallas. And we're on chapter 11 and 12, and we'll be finished. So let's see if I can squeeze in a chapter real early this morning here. So much had been happening lately. First the excitement over the baby, then the Massey's pulling out, that before I knew it, it was a week had passed and Persian Pickle had come around again. Club meetings were back on schedule, and so was I. Going out, at least to Pickle, didn't bother me anymore. Mrs. Judd was the hostess, so I thought surely Rita would find an excuse not to come. Those interesting things that Rita had found out about the Judds didn't sound very nice, and with the way she and Mrs. Judd felt about each other, Rita wouldn't be comfortable sewing in the Judd parlor. Women can't quilt when they're angry. It shows up in the stitches. Of course, even when Rita was in a good mood, her stitches weren't the best I'd ever seen. Despite my efforts, Rita at heart was not a quilter, and I began to doubt that she ever would be. To my surprise, however, Rita was at the Judds when I arrived, waiting for her. Waiting for me. She stood off by herself in the parlor, fidgeting and looking more ill at ease than she ever had. When she saw me, Rita grabbed my arm and said, "My God, Queenie, I sure am glad you're here. It makes me feel creepy being in this house." She bit the end off of a fingernail. Most of her fingernails had been chewed off, and the polish was a mess. "Oh, it's not so bad," I said. Although the truth was the Judd's parlor, with its heavy walnut furniture covered with brown upholstery, was as dreary a place as I'd ever seen. Paper with big tan feathers covered the walls, making me feel I was inside a pillow. The pictures were hung so high that you got a crick in your neck just looking up at them, although I don't know anybody who would bother to do so, since the same pictures were in every house in Kansas. They were End of the Trail, which showed an out-of-luck Indian about to fall off his horse, and another, whose name I never knew, of a bunch of dogs sitting around a poker table playing cards. That one was a favorite of Grover's. We had the same picture hanging in Dad Bean's old bedroom, and I hoped Grover would let me throw it out when we turned the room into a nursery. Rita curled her lip a little as she looked around the room, stopping at Mrs. Judd's prize wigged feet hanging on the wall. "Look at that quilt. There's a big hole in it," Rita said, touching a dark spot where the stuffing showed through. "It's a bullet hole, and the red around it, that's blood," I told Rita, who snatched her hand away. "The quilt belonged to Mr. Judd's father. He carried it all through the Civil War and claimed it saved his life when he was shot by a Confederate." Rita bit the end of her finger because there wasn't any nail left to chew. If that rifleman had been a better shot, there wouldn't be any Mr. Judd. I smiled a little, only to be polite to her, because it wasn't a nice thing to say. Then Rita whispered, "Murder seems to run in the family." I didn't know what she meant, but it reminded me I hadn't told her what the Masseys had said about Skillet. "Come over here," I said, glancing at Ella to make sure she was out of earshot. I drew Rita into the dining room and looked around because I didn't want anyone else to overhear either. Of course, Grover let Sheriff Eagles know what Blue and Zelpha had told us, but the sheriff kept it to himself, so I didn't care to upset the club members by bringing it up. They wanted to forget about Ben Crook's murder every bit as much as I did. "Here's your killer," I whispered. I told Rita the story of the Masseys overhearing a drifter say a man was buried in Ella's field. Blue and Zelpha knew about Ben's body before Hiawatha found it. That hobo at the campfire just had to be Skillet, the way they described him. "I know it was," I said. Rita listened without interrupting, furrowing her brow as I finished. "Well, maybe it was and maybe it wasn't." Rita thought a minute. "For crying out loud, Queenie, you know as well as I do that Skillet person didn't kill Ben Krug." She tapped her front teeth with her thumb. "Of course he could have been in on it one way or another. It sort of complicates things. I'll have to think about that." You're crazy, I sputtered. A man knows about being crooked, being buried before the body's found, and all you can say is it's something to think about. Rita ran her tongue back and forth over her lips. Hold your horses, Queenie. I'm not saying Skillet wasn't involved somehow, but I know for sure he didn't do it. Wait till you hear what I have to tell you. Do you know what a conspiracy is? Well, of course, I'm not dumb, I said, trying to remember what the word meant. What's this about a conspiracy? Mrs. Judd had come up behind us, and neither Rita nor I had noticed her until she spoke. She wore a brown dress with tan stripes that made her look like a piece of furniture. The dress was baggy with spots on the front and crumbs too, which wasn't like Mrs. Judd, who had always been tidy. She'd been a big woman once, but her bones seemed to have shrunk in the past few weeks, leaving her skin loose and saggy. Caring for Ella had taken its toll on Mrs. Judd, but she'd bite her tongue off before she'd utter one word of complaint. So would Prosper. So we're just talking, said Rita, who was a lot faster with the comebacks than I was. Yeah, talking, I added. Well, come and quilt, Mrs. Judd ordered. You can talk while you sew. She wet her fingers and touched the crumbs on her bosom, then brushed her hands together. Mrs. Judd went ahead of us into the parlor, and Rita drew her finger across her throat. Whew. Mrs. Judd's Dresden plate was ready for us in the quilt frame, which was propped up on the backs of 4 chairs. The club members gathered around it, telling Mrs. Judd how nice the quilt top looked. Even though Mrs. Judd didn't have an eye for color, she picked orange for the center of the design, which made the quilt look like a field of pumpkins. Mrs. Judd had bleached the sugar sacks she used for the background, but I could still make out the writing on some of them. The stitches in the quilt were nice and even. However, Ella leaned over to inspect them, and her monogram brooch fell off right onto the quilt, which was lucky because the pin was made of china and would have broken if it had hit the parlor linoleum carpet. Rita picked up the pen and handed it back to Ella, first brushing her fingers over the gold letters, E-E-C. Ella Crook, what does the middle initial stand for? Eagles. It's Ella's maiden name, Sarah said. Let's get started, Mrs. Judd interrupted. Sit any place you like. I'm not particular. Even so, Mrs. Judd maneuvered Ella as far away from Rita as possible. She didn't trust Rita any more than Rita trusted her, and I wished now that I'd found out what it was Rita knew. I didn't want to spoil our quilting by saying something rash. Ladies, the celebrity quilt's all bound, Mrs. Ritter announced as we took our places and began stitching around the Dresden plate's wedges. We all murmured our approval. We used red for the binding, the same fabric as the sashing. It's pretty, awfully pretty, Agnes T. Ritter said. Both Ada, June, and I stopped sewing to look at her. Agnes T. Ritter had never in her life said anything was pretty. Well, it is, she sniffed. It will make us famous, Nettie said. She looked at me and smiled, and I smiled back. Neither one of us was thinking about the quilt. We were thinking about Velma's baby, my baby. Still, I knew from the last club meeting that not one Pickle, including Nettie, would ever say a word out loud about the baby until it arrived, so Nettie and I only smiled. So famous, maybe somebody will ask us for our autographs for their celebrity quilt force, Dan said. Maybe so, Mrs. Judd put in. Maybe Lizzie Olive will. We laughed, and I was glad things were back to normal at the Persian Pickle Club. This was going to be as pleasant a quilting as I'd ever attended. The entire club had come, and except for Rita, who was still jumpy, we were all in a good mood. The room was sunny and big enough so that we weren't cramped. We sewed with the windows open since it was warm outside, but we didn't have to worry about chiggers because the first frost had killed them. We stitched quietly for a minute, then Opalina said she'd heard Blue and Zelpha had pulled out, and I nodded. I guess they just got itchy feet, I said. Drifters do that. That's why they're called drifters. Did they steal anything? Agnes T. Ritter asked. People who sneak away in the night most always take something. Now she was her old self again. No, not unless you count the girly calendar that the last hired man left behind a couple of years ago. I knew the Masseys hadn't taken it, however, because Grover had removed it when he took the Masseys to the cabin in the early summer, then tacked it up in the barn where he thought I wouldn't notice. But they left something behind. Zelpha gave me her road to California, I said, blushing, because the Pickles knew women didn't give you their best quilt unless you were special to them. Oh, a road to California is a nice quilt, Ella said. She was following things better that afternoon than she had in a long time. Zelpha's a fine quilter. She told me that in the hill country they throw a cat on top of the quilt as soon as the last stitch is in. If the cat jumps onto your lap, then you're the next to get married. I glanced at Agnes T. Ritter, but she didn't look up. I don't know where they went, but I hope the Masseys headed for California. Zelpha always talked about going there. Maybe she'll see Ruby, Ella whispered. Now, Ella, sweetheart, those people weren't the kind Ruby would be acquainted with. Besides, they don't even know Ruby's name, Mrs. Judd told her. We'll get a postal from Ruby one day soon, just you believe it. We talked about Ruby, wondering where she was and whether she ate oranges every day, until we heard the Packard drive up, and Mrs. Judd said, That'll be Prosper. He went to town for lemons. I forgot to get them yesterday. We'll have tea with lemons this afternoon. Prosper came into the parlor with a big bag clutched in both hands, and when he saw us, he blinked his little pink eyes and ducked his head with embarrassment. Our husbands stayed away from the Persian Pickle Club, and if they didn't, we shooed them out. Prosper took off his hat and looked around the circle, nodding at each one of us. When he come to Ella, he smiled and said, My, Miss Ella, don't you look pretty as paint? Oh, Prosper. Ella looked down at her needle and blushed. Prosper kept on around the circle, and when he reached Rita, he didn't nod, he just looked away. Well, hello, Mr. Judd, Rita called, bold as brass. Her voice was high and a little out of control, which made me look up. So did the others, and Prosper backed out of the room. I'll set these in the kitchen, Mother, Prosper said. The back door slammed and the Packard started up again. Mrs. Judd, who'd been watching Rita since Prosper left the room, continued to stare at her. In a minute, Rita glanced over and caught Mrs. Judd's eye, and the two of them watched each other like sniffing dogs, not saying anything. Ella didn't notice, and she said in her tiny voice, Prosper's the best man. It was the second time that afternoon that Ella had spoken up, and I was about to send her a smile of encouragement when suddenly Rita blurted out, Like hell, Ella, Prosper killed your husband. I don't think Rita had planned to say that. It just happened. Before she could stop the words, they were out. Rita froze, the point of her needle stuck in the quilt. The room was quiet. We could hear Opalina's needle go through the quilt. Opalina was sweating as usual, and her sticky needle squeaked as she pushed it through the cotton with her thimble. I finished my stitch at the instant I looked up at Rita, and I ran the needle into my finger. When I glanced down, I saw a little drop of blood on the dresden plate I was stitching around. I put my finger into my mouth. Nettie and Forrest Ann turned to each other with shock in their faces, and Mrs. Ritter grabbed Agnes T. Ritter's hand. Sarah's, her eyes wide, put her knuckles into her mouth and bit down. Ella held tightly to the seat of her chair to keep from sliding off, her face even whiter than usual. We exchanged glances with each other before turning to stare at Rita, who had a look of horror on her face at what she'd said. Her open mouth was a round O, and a little line of perspiration appeared on her upper lip. Her hands shook on the quilt, and to steady them, she held fast to the edge of the frame. At that very moment, before anyone spoke, a lazy winter fly buzzed in from the kitchen, made big swoops around the room, and landed on the light globe hanging above us. Mrs. Judd stood up slowly so that she wouldn't disturb it, took a fly swatter off the wall and slapped it against the light. The dead fly fell onto the quilt, landing on the bright orange center of one of the Dresden plates. Using the edge of the swatter, Mrs. Judd picked up the fly and carried it to the screen door. Flicking it outside, she closed the door and hooked it, returning the swatter to its nail, and sat down. "What's that you were saying about Mr. Judd?" Mrs. Judd's voice was quiet, but there was an edge of steel in it, the way it got when city people tried to talk her down on the price of her eggs. We looked at her as she spoke and turned to Rita for the answer. Rita swallowed uncomfortably, looking as if she'd wish she could fall through the floor. After making an accusation like that, she wouldn't back off, and I think she knew not one of us in that room was on her side. She opened and shut her mouth a couple of times before saying, "I told Ella your husband killed Ben Crook." Rita still didn't have control of her voice. "That's what I thought you said. You as much as told Prosper that the time you caught him out by the horse trough, didn't you?" Mrs. Judd waited quietly, but Rita didn't answer. The rest of us were too stunned to speak. Ella broke her silence. "Not Prosper," she stuttered. "He did, Ella." Rita gave her a pleading look, then turned again to Mrs. Judd. Her voice was firmer when she spoke this time. "You know he did it, don't you, Mrs. Judd? Why, I think you all know it, every one of you." She looked at each of us, even me, and I lowered my eyes. "No," Ella whimpered, but Rita didn't pay any attention to her. She watched Mrs. Judd instead. "You know all about it, do you?" Mrs. Judd asked. "You think you know what happened?" Rita gripped the edge of the quilt and leaned forward. "I know Prosper was making payments on Ella's mortgage. I know Ella needed you a field by the river just before Mr. Crook disappeared. I found that out in the records." I didn't know that. I glanced at Ada Jane, but her face showed she was as surprised as I was. "So," Mrs. Judd said, "so you think paying a mortgage makes Prosper a man-killer?" Rita leaned even further across the quilt toward Mrs. Judd. "Prosper was," she paused to find the right words, "romantically involved, I guess you'd say, with Ella. That's why he was paying off her mortgage. You found out about it, and Ella gave you that piece of land to keep you quiet. I think Mr. Crook caught the two of them together or something, so Prosper killed him. I'm not saying it was murder. It could have been an accident. I don't know how it happened, but Ella does. That's why you're keeping her here in your house, so she won't tell. I think the rest of you," she stopped long enough to look around the circle at each of us again, "I think you all know about it, and you formed a conspiracy to keep it a secret." So that was what a conspiracy was. Prosper didn't do it. "No, Prosper, never," Ella mumbled, shaking her head back and forth. Mrs. Judd reached over and put her hand on the back of Ella's head to keep her from wobbling, and Ella was still. So were the rest of us, sitting there as dumb as cows, unable to speak. I wish that fly would come back to relieve the tension in the room. Sarah's moved her lips, but no words came out. Even Mrs. Judd seemed talked out. My mouth was as dry as Kansas dust. Why hadn't I found out what Rita was up to and kept her from saying these terrible things? It was my fault this was happening. Rita took her silence to mean she was on to something, and she became bolder. "It's what newspapers call a crime of passion. Prosper paid Doc Sipes to say Ben might have fallen out of a tree and been buried by somebody who didn't have the money for a coffin. That's what the doctor put in the coroner's report, and the sheriff would have gone along with it if I hadn't written up the murder for the Enterprise. I couldn't figure out why unless Prosper bribed him. Then today I discovered he and Ella are family. He probably doesn't want the scandal." Rita turned to me with a pleading look, and I cringed. My loyalty was to the Pickles, not to Rita. I hoped the club members knew I hadn't encouraged Rita. Prosper's hired that man to stop Queenie and me on the road, and I think he was that skillet person, even though Queenie says he wasn't. Why, he probably helped Prosper bury Mr. Crook's body. If the judge were paying off half the people in Wabassu county, then no wonder Mrs. Judd was piecing on sugar sacks. But that wasn't what I was thinking just then. I put my hands over my ears to shut out Rita's accusations, but I still heard them, although by now Rita had stopped talking. I shook my head back and forth, hoping the rattling on my brain would drown out the sound. Instead, the terrible words exploded inside my head like 4th of July firecrackers. I prayed one of the other Pickles would speak, but it was as quiet as death in Mrs. Judd's parlor, and I thought my skull would burst if I didn't say something to end the silence. "Stop it! That's not true, Rita," I blurted out so loudly the sound echoed around the room. "Prosper and Skillet didn't bury Ben Crook. We did." No one else spoke. The only sound in the parlor was Opalina drawing in her breath. Rita turned to me in shock, even when she couldn't say anything. I looked around at the other members of the Persian Pickle Club, then burst into tears. "Oh, I'm sorry. I broke our promise." I put my head in my hands and sobbed. Rita would put our secret in the newspaper, and we would go to jail, and Grover and I would never have a baby. They watched me cry, too dumbfounded to even say a word of comfort. Then Mrs. Judd reached across the quilt with her hand, which was wrinkled and covered with liver spots as brown as the furnishings in her house. "It's all right, Queenie. One of us would have said it if you hadn't." I glanced up, but she was staring at Rita, so were the rest of the Pickles. They weren't angry at me, but their faces were set against her, and when Rita saw that, she shrank away from them. I almost felt sorry for her because Rita hadn't been out to hurt us. At that moment, I came to understand Rita. She wasn't lazy like Agnes T. Ritter claimed she was. Rita had worked as hard at solving Ben's murder as I'd ever worked at farming. And it sure wasn't easy with everyone trying to stop her. She had courage, because even though I knew that man on the road hadn't been sent by Ben's killer, Rita didn't. She believed he'd come back for her if she kept on with her reporting. Rita stayed with it so that she and Tom would have their chance, just like everyone else in Harveyville wanted a chance at something. For Rita and Tom, it meant getting away from farming. No matter how much I wanted Rita to live in the country and be a pickle, she didn't want that and never would. "I don't understand," Rita whispered, looking at us like a cornered animal. "How could? I don't." "Prosper never did Ella anything but kindness," Mrs. Judd broke in. "Prosper paid the mortgage Ben took out with the Topeka Bank on the farm, the old Eagles place, because Ben spent the money and the bank said it was going to foreclose. If it hadn't been for Prosper, Ella would have been turned off her own land. Ella deeded me the only field she still owned free and clear, since Ben had it in his mind to sell it out from under her. It didn't matter to him that the land was left to Ella by her people. Ben would have found a way. Many's the time Prosper risked his life going against Ben Crook for Ella's sake. Did it to protect Ella at the risk of his own precious life. Why, Ella wouldn't be alive today except for Prosper. You've no right to accuse him of being immoral with her. No right at all." Mrs. Judd's eyes flashed and the color came into her face, and she didn't look so tired after all. "That was an awful, awful thing to say," Ada June scolded. "Nasty," Nettie added, rubbing one index finger down the other in a sign of shame. Rita looked at each of us, but not a one of us showed her a friendly face, except Mrs. Ritter, of course. "It's not Rita's fault. Maybe we should have told her in the beginning," Mrs. Ritter said. "I think we'll have to tell her now." She looked around the circle for approval. "Do we have your permission, Ella?" she asked after the rest of us nodded. Ella's eyes were wild, and she clutched and unclutched her hands. I wondered if she understood Mrs. Ritter. "Ella, is it all right for Rita to know our secret about Ben?" Mrs. Judd asked her, saying each word slowly while the rest of us waited. Ella shrugged her shoulders up and down, but at last she murmured, "Yes, okay." Mrs. Judd looked at Mrs. Ritter. "You tell her, Sabra." Ben Crook was as mean a man as ever lived. He was born mean, and no one knew that better than Ella, Mrs. Ritter began. Smacked her all the time, crazy mad. Maybe Ella sat on a table when she was young. That's a sure sign you'll marry a crazy man, Nettie said. Agnes T. Ritter gave her a scornful look, and Nettie muttered, "Well, she could have. You don't know any different." "Awfulest man," Opalina added. "Evil, I believe to my soul he was truly evil, even though I hate to say that about a body," Sarah said. "I know he's in hell, and I'm glad for it." I glanced at Ella, who nodded her head up and down, but wasn't aware of it, because she continued nodding after Sarah's finished speaking. We saw him close the car door on Ella's hand once," Forrest Ann said. "On purpose. You can see yourself how it's bent because Ben wouldn't let Doc Sipes administer to Ella," Nettie added. I looked at Ella's little twisted hands and felt the pain myself. Ben took to sneaking around Forrest Ann's place evenings after her husband got killed. She was afraid of Ben, so she asked Doc to start stopping by. Forrest Ann shook her head at Nettie, who didn't finish. "I saw him," Agnes T. Ritter said, but Mrs. Judd broke in. "He was always after Ella. Just opening her mouth was an excuse for Ben to hit her. He used his fist or a poker, anything he could put his hands on. Who knows how she lived through it, or how she turned out to be the sweet thing she is. I think Ella goes someplace back in her head to hide, and that's what saved her." I glanced at Ella, who seemed to be hiding there now. "Sometimes she'd run away and hide with us," Mrs. Judd continued. "Prosper would stand up to Ben when he came looking for her, and there were times I thought Ben would kill him for it. Ben was a big man, and Prosper isn't so big, but he's man enough, don't you doubt it." Mrs. Judd paused to make sure we all knew how proud she was of her husband. "There were other ways Ben was mean. He trampled Ella's flowers because she loved them so, and he'd hide her shoes so she couldn't come to Pickle. Once when Ella had club meeting at her house, she baked a cake, got it all iced too, and Ben threw it to the pigs. That was the day he died, and I've never been sorry for it." "I don't suppose anybody else in this room is either," as we nodded in agreement. Mrs. Judd took a deep breath and sat back in her chair, talked out. "Septima knew everything, but the rest of us, we only knew a little of it. We never knew how terrible Ben was until that day," Opalina said. She reached over and put her hand on the top of Mrs. Judd's. "I remember when they were married, we didn't think Ben was much of a catch, except he was handsome, and oh, those hips. Hips'll do it. Ella was so happy," Sarah said. "Who would have guessed?" Sarah looked at Opalina and Mrs. Judd, who had known Ella in her youth, and both shook their heads. Now Rita spoke for the first time since I'd told our secret. "Well, why didn't Ella leave him? She could have gone to the sheriff. I suppose Sheriff Eagle is her brother, isn't he?" She stopped trembling, but her face was still pale. "Yes, he's that. Ella was too ashamed to tell him." Mrs. Judd stopped talking because Ella had put up her hand, and I knew she understood what was going on. "What is it, Sugar Pie? Did you want to say something?" Mrs. Judd asked. Ella gave her a wistful little smile as she traced the circle of the Dresden plate in front of her with her forefinger. "I love Ben," she said without looking up. "He promised he wouldn't hit me again." "Ha," Mrs. Judd said. "So Prosper killed him because he was mean to Ella?" Rita asked. "Then, after he did it, all of you buried the body?" "I told you Prosper didn't kill nobody," Mrs. Judd yelled, as though the loudness would get the words through Rita's head. I glanced out the window, glad no one was outside to hear. "Prosper didn't even know Ben was dead until Hiawatha found the body." "Then who killed him?" Rita asked. The question hung in the air as we all grew quiet again. We told Rita almost everything, but not that, not the final part of the secret. We looked around the circle at one another, avoiding Rita's eyes. Then each of us turned to Mrs. Judd, just as we always did when there was a difficult decision to make. Mrs. Judd sat with her elbow on her knee, her mouth in the palm of her hand, knowing without looking up that we expected her to speak. She blew out her breath, but before she could, Ella opened and shut her mouth like a little bird, then whispered, "I did." Rita looked at that tiny woman with astonishment. The rest of us did too. "I did it," Ella repeated, and then shrank back against her chair. She would have toppled over if Ada Jane hadn't grabbed her. "You?" Rita asked. "How?" Obviously she didn't believe Ella. Mrs. Judd snorted at the idea of Ella killing Ben Crook, but Ella replied quickly, "Snuck up behind him. I hit him with the fry pan. I said, don't throw out the cake. He hurt me bad." Tears rolled down Ella's cheeks, and she rubbed her eyes with her little fist. She was used to crying without making a sound, however, and the only noise in the room was the ticking of Rita's wristwatch, which seemed as loud as our alarm clock. "That's a lie." I didn't know who'd spoken. I looked at Ada Jane and Nettie and Forrest Ann. Then with astonishment I turned to Agnes T. Ritter, who spoke louder this time. "That's a lie, and you know it is, Ella," she said. "I killed Ben Crook." Agnes T. Ritter stared at Rita with her lips pressed together so hard they'd gone inside her mouth. She had to breathe, however, so her lips came back out, and she opened her mouth a crack. Agnes T. Ritter's eyes gleamed almost as if she was having a good time, because at last her mother wasn't telling her to be still. I was the first one to arrive for Persian Pickle that day, because Mom had the car in town, and I walked. It didn't take as long as I thought, so I got there early and heard Ben screaming at Ella. He hit her with his fist, and when she fell down, Ben kicked her. I saw it through the window, and by the time I got to the door, Ben had a butcher knife in his hand. Ella was curled up in a little ball, and I knew if she wasn't dead already, she would be in a minute if I didn't stop him. I picked up the skillet from the stove next to him and bashed Ben over the head with it. I didn't mean to kill him, but I'm not sorry I did. Agnes T. Ritter sat back in her chair defiant. Mrs. Ritter leaned over and put her arms around Agnes T. Ritter. "No, dear, you don't have to protect me," Mrs. Ritter said, then turned to Rita. "The stove isn't next to the door. You're smart enough to find that out, Rita. I got to Ella's in the car before Agnes arrived, and I killed Ben. I didn't use any skillet either. It was the side of the axe that Ella kept outside for chopping wood. I never saw a mad dog go after a person the way Ben went for Ella. He was an insane man. I didn't have a choice." "You didn't either do it, Sabra," Nettie interrupted. "I did." "We did," Forrest Ann corrected. "Nettie and I killed him dead. Nettie called out to him to stop, and I ran behind him and bashed him with the noggin with the flat iron. I'm not one bit sorry. I sleep good at night knowing nobody has to worry about being crook again." "I'm an old woman, and I'm willing to take my punishment," Sarah told Rita. Ada Jane shook her head. "I know you're trying to protect me with my kids and all, but I'll own up to it. Lord knows he deserved it." She looked Rita in the eye. "I struck him with a piece of kindling. I did it 2 or 3 times until he stopped moving." "The truth is," Mrs. Judd broke in, and everybody turned to her, "the truth is I'm the only one strong enough to mash in Ben Crook's head, and I'm the only one mean enough to do it." "Oh, no, dear. I stood on the chair so I could hit him," Opalina said. Mrs. Judd gave Opalina such an astonished look that I almost laughed. We all put him in Mrs. Judd's Packard and drove him out to the field to bury him. Then we swore a pact that if anyone ever brought up Ben's name, we'd say he loved Ella and thought the sun rose and set on her, I explained. "I guess we did it too much. With so many men walking away from their families these days, why, folks just naturally thought that's what Ben did," Sarah's added. "Ben didn't have any family, and Ella was the only one who cared about him. Everybody else in Harveyville was glad he was gone. Who'd take the trouble to look for him?" I said. The others nodded. "But it was a murder," Rita said, drawing out the word and shuddering. Murder? You think killing a crazy man who's about to beat his own wife to death is a murder? Agnes T. Ritter asked her. Rita didn't reply. No one else spoke either. We were relieved when a car drove past to give us something to listen to besides the sound of our own voices. I was more tired than I'd ever been in my life. I could have put my head down on the quilt right then and gone to sleep. The others were weary too, especially Mrs. Judd, who had black half moons under her eyes. The fire had gone out of her. She knew this wasn't over, however, and when the sound of tires on the dirt road faded away, she asked, "Now that you know the truth, Rita, what are you going to do?" Mrs. Judd's question was one we all wanted answered, although it was not one of us had the courage to ask it. Rita frowned at the as she thought it over. She wouldn't meet her eyes. I wondered if the others heard my heart pounding away. "You won't put it in the paper, will you? Anson would lose his job, and they might chop off our heads just like chickens," Opalina said, and she started to cry. Sarah's reached over to hold Opalina's hand while Mrs. Judd said, "Hush, the state of Kansas doesn't behead anybody." "We didn't tell you this to put it in the newspaper," Agnes T. Ritter said slowly. "We told you because you are a member of the Persian Pickle Club, because you are one of us. We extended the hand of friendship to you, and there's nothing in the world that's stronger than friendship. You had the right to know our secret because we trust you." I had never heard Agnes T. Ritter say anything so fine, and I wanted to hug her for it. The idea of doing that almost made me giggle. Rita thought hard, her teeth biting into her bottom lip. She had chewed off all the lipstick and the skin was raw. I remember that night in the Ritter kitchen when Rita had sworn to sell her soul to get out of Harveyville. She wouldn't have to sell her soul now. She'd just have to sell our story to the newspaper. As I watched Rita twist her wedding ring around her finger, I saw how rough and cracked her hands were. Not at all pretty like they were the first time I saw her. The thumb where she had torn off a hangnail was bleeding onto the edge of the quilt. I promised to write one more article for the Topeka Enterprise, and I told the editor I wasn't certain I knew who killed Ben Krug. He'd think I was stupid if I didn't come up with something, Rita said, choosing her words carefully. She put her hands in her lap and looked directly at me. I wanted to turn away, but knew I had to look her in the eye. Sarah's put her arm around my shoulder. "Just today, Queenie told me a story what happened before Mr. Crook's body was found. A man at a campfire said he knew somebody was buried in Ellis Field." Rita paused and gave a little laugh. "Why, you'd have to be as big a dummy as Charlie McCarthy to think it was anybody but that Skillet. It's my duty to write a story about Skillet, you know, to warn people to watch out for drifters." Rita looked a little pleased with herself as she finished and winked at me. As each of us understood what Rita had said, we sighed with relief and smiled at her. I unclenched my hands to see that my nails had sunk through the flesh and drawn blood that had dripped onto the quilt in front of me. We spilled more blood on Mrs. Judd's Dresden plate that day than the Whigs' defeat had gotten during the whole Civil War. "That's a real good idea. You tell folks to start locking their doors at night," Nettie said. "It would be what you'd call a service to mankind," Forrest Ann added. "And women," Opalina added. The rest of us chimed in about what a help a story like that would be to people, especially who live out in the country. Sarah said that she knew Rita would do a bang-up job. "Maybe you could run his picture," Opalina said. "Now, who takes a picture of a hired man?" Mrs. Judd asked, and we all laughed. Ella didn't laugh. She didn't say anything either, which made the rest of us grow quiet again. I wondered if Ella would object to Rita's story, but she didn't. In fact, she wasn't listening to us anymore. She smiled to herself and took up her needle, which had been lying on top of the quilt, and made half a dozen stitches, pulling the thread through as she hummed a little tune under her breath. "Why, shame on us. We've hardly quilted all day," Mrs. Ritter said. One by one, each member of the Persian Pickle Club, including Rita, picked up her needle and began stitching around the Dresden plates. We sewed quietly for a long time, no longer feeling a need to talk, until at last Mrs. Judd stuck her needle into the quilt and took off her thimble. Somebody tell me where the time's gone. I forgot all about refreshments. She placed her hands on the side of her chair and hefted herself up. I'll put the tea kettle on. Hot tea always hits the spot after an afternoon sewing. Did I tell you I've got fresh lemons? Mrs. Judd took a few heavy steps toward the kitchen before stopping to place her hand on the back of Rita's chair and leaning over to examine the quilt in front of her. Honey, those are real nice stitches. You're coming along just fine. She straightened up and added, we've had an awful good quilting this evening, haven't we, ladies? Why, you might say it's been the best Persian pickle we've ever had. And that's the end of chapter 11. One more chapter to go. All right, see y'all.